Are you differing in the way that you express your emotions than your partner? Does the way that they talk about the way that they feel bother you? Like the way that they get angry seems too loud, or they do things that embarrass you, or they always want to talk about their feelings, or you always want to talk about your feelings and they don't. Well, I want to talk to you today about how so common it is for couples to differ in the way that they were taught to express their feelings growing up. Every relationship is a cross-cultural experience. Hi, I'm Stephanie Cook, and I'm the director at Couples Counseling ATL here in Atlanta, Georgia, serving couples all over Georgia. And I want to teach you what you can do if you and your partner really view emotions differently, because it can result in some arguments, or it can result in you feeling really lonely or misunderstood. Every family has a different culture around emotion, so it's normal to think and feel differently about emotion. And you could define culture as a set of beliefs and practices that guide us through our life. Our emotional culture vary based on our attitudes, our philosophies, our feelings, our behaviors, and they are shaped by our past family experiences, good and bad. If you have a history of trauma too, it can create feelings of comfort or discomfort with certain emotions. And then, all of our culture from home and from the wider culture shapes how we feel today. So let's say that your partner came from a family where they were loud and constantly argued in front of the children. And maybe they would feel a little scared of how intense it could get. And sometimes they'd be up late at night thinking about it. And the emotion kind of made them a little scared. And so they might later, as an adult, think of really expressive emotions as being disrespectful. And it might also make them kind of shut down a little bit when their partner starts to express in this way that reminds them of their childhood. So couples, when they start to get into talking about this and maybe want to change the pattern, they need to learn that they just have a mismatch, and it's not unresolvable. Like, it's just something they're going to have to learn to live with. But a couples therapist or learning something, about how to manage that can be really helpful. So you might need to talk about how do you feel about negative emotions like anger, disappointment, frustration, sadness, disgust. You may not be able to control how your partner feels about those emotions. And so it's really important that you don't make your partner shut down by the way that you express yourself, and vice versa. Some people are all about action. They really want to solve the problems. They don't like to think about their emotions or their partner's emotions. They want to kind of keep it moving. And then some other people are more comfortable with negative emotions and sadness and anger, and they might want to talk about it more, and they might need to talk about it more. The first type of person who really kind of avoids most emotions is paired with someone who really wants to talk about emotions. We call that a major mismatch, but it's common, and it is something you can still be happy about as a couple. And you're not going to change each other's attitudes about the emotions, but it can result in escalating fights or avoidance if you don't learn how to bridge that gap. The question becomes, how do you get to a solution when one of you feels differently about emotions than the other? So emotional acceptance is going to be important, in understanding your problems and your differences. You need to understand each other's feelings and thoughts first, even if you don't spend a lot of time on it. You really are going to need to talk about understanding each other before working on any sort of solution or action. It's gonna be a little bit more uncomfortable for the emotion, like dismissing sort of person who didn't really have a good experience with emotions growing up, but we can all stretch ourselves, right? So if you learn how to handle your emotional differences with more graciousness, it can really help you to prevent unnecessary arguments later on without pathologizing each other. So you've got to create your own culture together that's different than your family's, where you both decide together how you'd like to handle different emotions that come up, like anger or sadness. The happy feelings, a little bit easier for most couples to handle. What you shouldn't be doing is saying something like, hey, can we talk about anger? How do you feel about anger? I don't really think about it. I don't know. If I get angry, it's just for a second and it's gone. Well, I get angry really easy, and I like to talk about it and I share it. And if I don't talk about it, it doesn't go away very easily. What about me? Are you angry at me? Well, yeah, you get really loud sometimes. It's embarrassing. What? Are you kidding me? This is another moment of you being angry at me? Are we always talking about our feelings? See, it's starting to kind of escalate. They feel differently. One really needs to express. One person is feeling criticized. And it's really important that maybe you start talking just about, in a non-critical way, about your own history with emotions. Like, well, when I was growing up, my family expressed their anger really easily, really loudly. We would feel it and then it was done. But sometimes it kind of got out of control, and then it made me really just think of people who express their anger really loudly and kind of in a critical way as, I don't know, being disrespectful, or I start to see them as not being in control, and they seem kind of childish. So maybe somebody has a really negative experience with emotions because they were expressed in a really kind of scary way. So maybe you don't agree with them, but you might be able to validate that. So it feels like a big mountain for you, a mountain of emotion, and you don't like to hear it, especially expressed towards you, right? You might talk about how it relates to your relationship. So, I want you to be able to express your anger, but when you get really loud, it kind of reminds me of my older brother who would explode all the time when we were younger. Or I want you to be able to express yourself when you're sad, but it reminds me of my mother who was depressed. Or, I have some sensitivities. So it's important, as you're talking about your own family history and culture and why certain emotions are a little bit more difficult for you, to invite your partner to understand, and likewise to try to understand why it's so important to them, that maybe you're just aware of certain sensitivities. To problem solve, once you feel both really, really understood about your histories around that emotion, or how it was expressed, or how it was avoided growing up, you might say, well, even though I don't want our family to be like my family growing up, I do know that your preference is a little different than mine, and maybe next time you're angry, you can write it down, and we can sit down and talk about it. Or maybe if you could really, lower your voice a little bit, that would probably help me to not think of my brother. And then maybe you could come up with some ways of co-regulating, like if it starts to feel intense, like you hold hands, or you go on a walk to talk about it, or you take a break if needed. One person in particular who might be more emotionally dismissive is much more likely to kind of get out of that window of tolerance in terms of their own physiology. They're probably avoiding certain emotional topics too because it feels too intense. And so helping them to keep their heart rate down, keeping the conversation short but soft, being able to express yourself. Both people can probably stretch themselves a little bit in terms of learning how to sit with emotions that they don't like, or for the conversation to be a little shorter than they might like if they're more emotionally embracing, right? So think about this in terms of your own relationship. If you really struggle with emotion, a great book that you might want to read is Permission to Feel. That's it. Permission to Feel is a great book about emotions and the importance of emotions and understanding your own emotions and the emotions of others. Emotions are also how we connect, right? So even if it's not your preference to kind of express emotions a lot or dwell on emotions, it's important for you to know that without expression of emotions, our partner won't know what we really like or dislike, and likewise, we won't know what they really like or dislike. And we have to bring up things like anger, frustration, disappointment in order to kind of course correct, in order to adjust and create the kind of life that is not just good for us, but that's good for our partner. So see emotion as your friend, and remember that both of you came from very, very different emotional backgrounds and cultures. So you can sit down with a therapist at like Couples Counseling ATL, but you can also do this on your own if you feel confident that the two of you can stay relatively calm. You can talk about the different ways that emotions were either allowed or not allowed. You can talk about how you personally feel when certain emotions are expressed, your favorite way of expressing each of those emotions, what you feel most comfortable with, if there's any way that other people express those emotions that makes you feel uncomfortable, and why, again, without criticizing or judging your partner. And you can also just continue to make this a mini part conversation. It doesn't have to be a one-time we discussed emotions We don't need to go back to that. You're probably going to need to talk about emotions for the rest of your life in order to stay close. Just because maybe you felt one way in your 20s about emotions doesn't mean you'll feel that way in your 50s or 60s. You may do some therapy, you may read some books, you may have some personal experiences, losses, joys like giving birth to a child. You may experience not just negative emotions in a different way as you age, but you also may experience really like fun, playful emotions, joy, awe. All of those things also may change over time, and the positive emotions are just as important to explore and talk about with your partner as the negative emotions. So think about this a little further. Consider talking to your partner about how you were raised differently and what emotions mean to each of you. And if you need more help with this, give us a call at Couples Counseling ATL or counselingatl.com, and you can schedule a free 20-minute video consultation with a therapist of your choice. Thanks. Have a great day.